All right, cool. Take it away.
All right, cool. So this talk is going to be on two chapters of my dissertation, and I got most of the data for these two chapters, so it's not going to change that much, but I'm still trying to, put a story together. But really, I'm looking at how like really two processes are affecting this Gallatin River catchment region. And when I say the Gallatin River catchment region, I kind of also mean I think some of it applies to the Madison catchment as well. Um, And so I just want to give some acknowledgements first. Dr. Miller, he was my undergraduate professor, and he actually has helped me a lot through my master's and my PhD. Susan Vuk, my first field season out there, she came out with us and she showed us a lot of her secret spots, and she really saved me a bunch of time because I would have just been driving around looking for stuff. And then Lauren, I don't know his last name, but he's the one who let me on his private property. He was a really cool guy, and there's really good exposures on his property. And then my field assistants, Wyatt, Wenbo, and Frank, lab assistants that saved me a lot of time processing samples, collaborators, and then funding from the NSF grant that paid for a lot of this stuff, the Tobacco Roots Geological Society. So that's some of you guys. The Colorado Scientific Society and the GSA Graduate Student Research Grant. Okay, so here is a figure of Southwest Montana. And, in the mid-Miocene, you kind of have two things going on. One is the outbreak of the Yellowstone hotspot, and then you also have the initiation of Basin and Range style extension in this area. And so the hotspots had a pretty big impact on topography. You've had drainage rearrangement, you've had subsidence on the trailing margin, you've had uplift, and then there's evidence of erosional exhumation in some places. And then you also have the initiation of Basin and Range style extension sometime in the mid-Miocene. That's generally what they say, but a lot of these faults in terms of when they start moving, it's not actually constrained like in terms of actual numbers. And so my study area, the Gallatin River catchment, is over here. It's a good place because one, the headwaters start on the hotspot bulge. And also it's on this eastern edge of the Basin Range extensional province. And so really the kind of big picture question for my dissertation is, how are these two processes recorded in this region, and how are they affecting the region or the landscape? So here's the actual Gallatin River catchment, a geologic map of the area. And it's cool because you have this upper bedrock region that's eroding, and then you have this basin that's catching all that sediment. So you kind of have two areas to look at to really understand how this area is evolving in the Neogene. And so the first chapter of my dissertation is going to be looking at the Sixmile Creek Formation in that basin and trying to see what's recorded in it. And then the second chapter is looking at the exhumation history of the upper part of the bedrock catchment to see if there's a signal from the hotspot or maybe even faulting. And then it's not up here, but my third chapter is going to be doing thermochronology transect on the northern Madison Range fault, which is somewhere up in here, and then the Gallatin Range fault to try and model when those faults started moving. So here's some more motivation or questions. So what does the Gallatin River catchment landscape look like in terms of drainage and relief and stuff like that? What does the Sixmile Creek Formation record in this area? How does it compare to other places like the Ruby area? And what's the influence of the Yellowstone hotspot bulge on the catchment or the drainage? So we're going to get into chapter 1 first, the Sixmile Creek Formation. Again, the research question or goal is, what does it record in this region? So my methods are stratigraphic columns for lithofacies and depositional environment characterization, class counts and paleocurrents for provenance to try to see where the sediment's coming from, to try to zircon uranium lead dating for maximum depositional ages and provenance, and then argon dating or geochronology for depositional ages as well. And so I think a lot of you guys know the background on the Sixmile Creek Formation, but I'll just give a quick rundown. So it's found throughout southwest Montana and I guess parts of central Montana too. It's mid-Miocene to Pliocene in age, so 17 to 5 MA roughly. You know, it's not it varies in some places. There's a regional unconformity below it that separates it from the Renova Formation, which I'm not really going to talk about the Renova Formation, maybe just a little bit. But it's said to record, you know, changing tectonic and landscape conditions. So here's a map of Southwest Montana with associated tertiary deposits. Pretty sure all these places also have the Sixmile Creek Formation. And so other workers have done a really good job of looking at it, the Sixmile Creek Formation in this area here, the Ruby Valley near Dillon. And they've done a good job of reconstructing, you know, what drainages looked like in the past and reconstructing fault histories. And so we're gonna go over here and see how the Sixmile Creek Formation looks in this area. So here's again the catchment or the Gallatin River catchment. And we're going to zoom into the basin right there. And one thing that's kind of interesting is you have 4 normal faults kind of bounding the basin. The Gallatin Range fault, the Elk Creek fault, the Bridger fault, and the Central Park fault with really not that much information on them. And so Susan and others mapped the Sixmile Creek Formation in this area. They broke it into the lower Madison Valley member and the upper Madison Plateau member. And most of the data that I have is actually going to come from the bluffs because that's where you can see the whole section from top to bottom, and you can also see the unconformity in some places. And also it's really hard to get access anywhere in Bozeman. There's like a lot of private property and people don't like you poking around. But I do have some data from that part of the basin or this kind of area right here. But I'm not going to really focus on stuff over here because that gets into different stuff with the Bridger Fault and the Bridger Range. So here's the bluffs. There's really good exposures in the bluffs, especially on that guy's private property. It's like really nice. But you know, based on my work, I broke the Sixmile Creek Formation into 4 units based on distinct changes in the stratigraphy. And so those are mapped out. So the red line is the unconformity. The Renova formations below that. And I have units 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's what I call them. And so just really quick, because I think people might want to see this, I just have a generalized strat column. So here's unit 1. So here's the unconformity. You have the Renova formation below the unconformity. And this part of the Renova formation, this member would be the Dunbar Creek member. And then you have units 1, units 2, units 3, and then unit 4. And then you have a pediment surface inset into that. And so unit 4 is what they mapped as the Madison Plateau member in the bluffs. I'd say it's a pediment gravel. And then unit 3, I'm going to go over these units in detail in the next couple slides, but just real quick, unit 3 is a bunch of hotspot tephras. And so the pink lines are argon dates. And then the brownish orange are zircon, detrital zircon maximum depositional ages. So that means that's the oldest the sediment can be. So the base, I think this is like 6 or 7 meters from the base. There's about 17 MA, which is pretty consistent with other places. Then I have another one in unit 1, it's about 15. Oh, this one right here, I'm still working on getting it sent out, so I'll get that sent out at some time. And then these 2 argon samples that I collected in this unit 3, they were pretty close together, but they yielded the exact same argon age of about 9.4 MA. And then the trial zircon MDM maximum depositional age for that is a little bit older. And then the pediment gravel is about 7.1 MA. And so I used detrital pi by Charman to get these MDAs, and he uses a certain he uses Garrels or Dickinson and Garrels to calculate these MDAs. So if anybody wanted to know that. Okay, so getting into unit 1, this is the base of the Sixmile Creek in this area. It's really cool, actually. So there's a lot of soil stuff going on. So you get this really resistant kind of package of sediment that's laterally continues throughout the whole bluffs. It's a bunch of stacked channel deposits, floodplain deposits, a lot of the lateral accretion surfaces. It's It's pretty cool. You can see a lot of the fluvial architecture if you go out there. And in some places you can see the contact with the Renova Formation or the unconformity really well. And it's about 20 meters thick. And so I did class counts at this exact location actually. And so most of the class tend to be orthoquartzites and other sedimentary rocks, and then the paleocurrents kind of have this westward flow. And so I did class counts in the Renova Formation, the Dunbar Creek member right below. And what I'm trying to show with this figure is that, like, based on the categories of class that I used, the percentages are pretty similar. All right. And then what I'm trying to say is that perhaps you have Renova Formation being recycled into the underlying Sixmile Creek Formation, or into the basal Sixmile Creek Formation. And the reason I say that is because if you look at these fault blocks here, the footwall Dale Creek Fault, you have the base of the Renova at 1,500 meters. And then you have in the valley, you have the base at about 1,300 meters. So, you know, as you're starting to get movement on these fault blocks, you could be eroding Renova and then recycling it into the Sixmile Creek Formation. And I'll talk about this later, but based on the detrital zircon data, I'm pretty sure you're at least getting zircon from the Renova recycled into the Sixmile Creek Formation. So you get into unit 2 and you get a change in the class and what you see in the conglomerate class. It's still a bunch of fluvial deposits. It's about 40 meters thick, but you get a change to mostly volcanic and metamorphic class. And then you get these northwest westward oriented paleocurrents. And I actually found a tortoise fossil in this unit, so it's pretty cool. Yeah, it sits in my office on a book. It's pretty cool. So the source of those, you know, the metamorphic rocks, I'm pretty sure are coming from the basement. And then the volcanic rocks, they match what you see in the Absaroka volcanic field. So I'm pretty sure those are the sources. And so what I'm trying to say is that I think units 1 and 2 are recording, you're starting to get movement on these fault blocks, and then you're incorporating that material into the Sixmile Creek Formation. One thing I forgot to mention is, so here's the pediment surface. You also have the matching the other surface on this side of the Massey River. This Elk Creek Fault offsets the other surface, so it's just something to keep in mind. And so the only other place where you can really see the base of the Sixmile Creek Formation is in this little creek over here. I don't know what it's called. So if you look, so this is the creek, we're looking west. So, you know, you're looking that way. There's the Renova Formation, the Sixmile Creek Formation. The base is made out of this diamix, so this like poorly sorted, class supported, or gravel with class that are all Archean metamorphic rock. And some of these are pretty big too. So like this one is like the size of the hammer. So I would say these are debris flow deposits. And, you know, they're probably sourced from, well, I'm sure they're sourced from, you know, the footwalls, or at least that footwall of these faults, because they match the lithologies exactly. And then you get into unit 3, and it's just about 30 meters of these hotspot tephras or reworked deposits. And then you get into unit 4 and the pediment gravel, and you get a change in composition to mostly orthoquartzites, and you get these westward oriented paleocurrents. And so for the longest time, I thought I really wondered where these came from, because Susan, or at least in the maps, they say they're belt supergroup quartzites, but that's what I thought for a long time. But actually, they are Archean aged quartzites. You find them, there's blocks or chunks in these footwalls as well. And then the detrital zircon data, I think, supports that they're from the footwalls of these faults. So I'm going to get into the detrital zircon data, but just a quick background. So zircon's pretty common mineral. You find almost everywhere, not everywhere because there wasn't any in the Renova Formation for the samples that I tried to process. But you have zircons, you can send them in to get a uranium lead date, and that's usually corresponds to a crystallization age. And so you have a source rock, with a bunch of zircons in it, and it gets eroded and it gets transported to your sediment. So you take your sediment, you get the zircons and then you send them in and they give you a bunch of data back. But usually your sources will have multiple different types of zircons with different ages. So you end up with populations of ages of zircon. And so here's the detrital zircon data for these units. Unit 2 isn't in here because I'm still working on it, still trying to get processed. So I have unit 1, unit 3, and then for unit 4, the gravel, I took samples for the matrix and also the class. So I'll just point out that unit 3, it's like all hotspot zircons. It's kind of hard to show this or really look at this data because it goes from 0 to 3 billion. And so you have a lot. You have a lot in this, like 0 to 100 that's really hard to see if you plot it all up like this. But I think what's kind of important. So the reason I said you're getting detrital or you're getting zircons recycled from the Renova Formation into Sixmile Creek Formation is because you have Oligocene age populations in pretty much all the samples. So you have like 29, 27 MA zircons, which would come from the Renova Formation, and they're getting put into the 6 Mile Creek Formation. But this peak here, the 1.7 billion years, that's pretty distinct. Okay. And if you look at the gravel for unit 4, that's most of it is 1.7 billion years old. So that corresponds to the big sky orogeny. These other ones are kind of distinct too. I'm not really going to talk about these, but if some of you guys want to talk about those, we can, and I can show you the data too. So the big sky orogeny, this is from that Arms and Baldwin paper that's in the Geology of Montana book that you guys came out with, which comes in handy. But it shows the extent of the big sky orogeny here. And so here's kind of the area where we're dealing with. And so those zircons have to come from somewhere in this area here. Okay, they're not coming from here in this area up here. And the reason I say that is because the paleocurrents also within the area, or within the valley or the basin kind of show that the sediment is being sourced from, upstream up the catchment or from, the range front. And so Bob Schwartz, we had a student also that did some work similar to this in 2006. So I just took his data and it kind of agrees with, sourcing of sediment from something similar to what you have today. So what I'm trying to show is that by the time the 6 Mile Creek Formation is being deposited, sometime in the mid-Miocene, you have sediment being sourced from, upstream, similar to what you have today. And so I guess my conclusions are that I think the two units 1 and 2, they're recording motion on those faults. You're starting to get fault motion by at least 17 MA or probably before. And I think, the Gallatin River catchments or something similar to it was already kind of established by mid-Miocene times around, by the time, at least the time the 6 Mile Creek Formation is being deposited. And I think you can correlate lithostratigraphic members. So those deposits, those are that you see in the bluffs, most of them are your fluvial axial drainage deposits. So those would correlate with, I think, the Big Hole River member. And then that unit 3, the tufts, would be the Anderson Ranch member, I think is what he called it. And then the base and margin deposits, they're kind of hard to define because I think access is hard. But those would correlate with the third member. I forget what it's called. And then the sequence boundaries add up, so the timing is pretty similar in terms of EA to the Sixmile Creek Formation. Okay, so that's chapter 1. Now we're getting into chapter 2, exhumation from the bedrock record. So really, the research goal is to look at the exhumation history, the Neogene exhumation history, and see if there's a signal from the hotspot. Okay, so the methods are apatite, uranium, thorium, helium, and helium-4, helium-3 thermochronology, and then thermal history modeling. So a background on this, so you get the hotspot, you get the hot material coming up, and you get a big bulge, And so when you get a big bulge, you get uplift, and you're going to increase slope and a bunch of stuff, and you're going to increase erosion. So that erosion is going to cause exhumation. So you're moving rocks, and you're going to cause rocks to come to the surface and cool. And so you can record that with thermochronometry. And so just a quick background on some of these thermochronometers. So the apatite, uranium, thorium, helium thermochronometer is a low temperature thermochronometer. And so it takes advantage of the uranium, thorium, samarium systems. They decay, their radioactive isotopes, they decay. And one of their daughter products is helium-4, which is a gas. So what this figure is showing is that you have, in this case, rocks with apatite. You erode material, and then you're causing these rocks to come up and cool. The helium for this system starts to be retained at like about 80 degrees Celsius. And so that's when you can kind of think of that clock starting. So, they pass, this is an isotherm. Let's say this is the 80 degrees Celsius isotherm. Once they pass through that, they start to retain that helium. So you send your apatites in to get measured for uranium, thorium, samarium, and helium, and they send you back a date that is a function of its thermal history or a function of how it, cools through the crust. And then, that date along with other information they send you, that you can put that in a software, which we use Hefty, that can give you cooling histories or thermal histories. And so Chloe Weeks was my advisor's master's student. She actually did the apatite, uranium, thorium, helium thermochronometry in the upper part of the catchment to look at the exhumation history. And so these are the transects she collected. She collected samples from Big Sky and near Gallatin Gateway. And so she did get results, but I'll go over this in a second. But my contribution was to also collect samples closer to the hotspot because there could be a spatial relationship. For both apatite, uranium, thorium, helium, and helium-4, helium-3 thermochronometry, but these samples are really weird. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so something else is actually coming out with these samples, so I'm not going to talk about those. But yeah, so those are Chloe's samples. And so she did this about 2 years ago using apatite, uranium, thorium, helium. And so her results, these are her results. So this is what you get so this is using Hefty. This is what you get when you model the data. So these are cooling histories. So you have time going down this way, and then you have temperature going up. So you're cooling. And these are cooling paths that best fit the data that you put in. So like the age of the apatite, uranium, thorium, helium, and the data or the other parameters. So what her results show that you get a lot of cooling in the Eocene or Oligocene. So that's this part here. And that you get, cooling after 10 MA, which would be associated with erosional exhumation from the hotspot, is limited to less than about 50 degrees Celsius. But this thermochronometer, so that's this part here. So you're seeing a bunch of cooling here from, the Eocene to Oligocene. You're getting a lot of cooling. And then here you have a little bit, say after 10 MA. But this thermochronometer, the apatite, uranium, thorium, helium thermochronometer, isn't sensitive enough to elucidate on those lower temperature cooling histories. So that's where the helium-3 thermochronometer comes in. It's more sensitive to those lower temperatures. So I'm just going to go over this briefly as well. But I like this little illustration that I made because the helium-3 thermochronometer uses the distribution of helium inside of the grain instead of, just the bulk amount. So if you look, let's say the blue dots are helium inside of the grain. They would have these two would have the same amount of helium, so they'd give you the same uranium, apatite, uranium, thorium, helium date, but they have different cooling histories because of how the helium is distributed within the grain. So like this one would have maybe cooled faster, and then this one would have cooled slower, and you have more helium kind of distributed evenly throughout the grain. So its helium distribution is a function of its thermal history. And so what you do is you take these grains and then you degas them step by step. And so, the first steps, the helium is going to come out from the sides until you get all the way to the center of the grain. And with that data, you put it into another software. We use MATLAB software for this. And then it gives you cooling histories. And so this is an example. So these are two cooling histories here that you would get from modeling the apatite, uranium, thorium, helium data. So they'd give you the same date, same number, but this one here, you get no cooling after about 5 MA, and then this one you do get cooling after 5 MA. But the helium diffusion profiles are different. And so that can tell you a lot if you put it into the model. And so this is what the data actually looks like. So here is here's the helium data. So this is the amount of helium released per step in the degassing. And the green line, so these are all thermal history models here. The software runs them, and then it comes up with its own helium data, and then it matches it to your data. And so the green paths are cooling paths that fit the data really well. The yellow lines are acceptable, and then the red lines are bad fits. But there's no red lines in this one. So this is from the Big Sky transect, so near Big Sky. And I put this one up here because it's one of the nicer samples. But if you look at it, you do get cooling at like 40 MA. So here you're going, you're cooling with time, and then you kind of holding out here. And so it does show that you get, so we're looking at these here. It shows you get 40 to, 35 degrees of cooling sometime between like 20 and 0 MA. And so that's just one sample. You have to look at them kind of all together and then make your interpretations. So these are the other samples. And I spent a lot of time looking at these samples. And so what I would say, my interpretations after looking at all this, I say that all the samples do agree with about 35 to 40 degrees of cooling that occurs in the mid to late Miocene. So that's kind of vague because it's really hard to actually pinpoint what that timing is. But if I had to say, I'd say like 17 to 5 MA, somewhere around there. And so there's two things that I would say there's two things that could do that. One would be erosional exhumation from the hotspot bulge, or climate. You have the mid-Miocene climactic optimum going on kind of at that time. But I don't think it's climate because there's isotope data from, I think it's the Paradise Valley, a valley over to the east, where they look at isotopes in the 6 Mile Creek equivalent for around the time that the mid-Miocene climactic optimum is going on. And what they say is that climate doesn't really change that much during this time. So then I would interpret it to be the result of, erosional exhumation due to the hotspot bulge. thing is a little fast, but I'm going to come back to these questions. So what does the Gallatin River catchment paleo landscape look like? So I think the drainage system is very similar to what you have today, back when the Sixmile Creek Formation is being deposited. Maybe you don't have those range foot faults. You don't have as much relief until they start moving. And so what does it record, the Sixmile Creek Formation in that area? I think it records faulting. I don't know if it tells you much about the Yellowstone hotspot in terms of it coming in and doing a bunch of stuff. You do see, a thick package of hotspot deposits, but I don't think it's telling you much about what the hotspot is doing in terms of erosion, in terms of sediment. And how does it compare to the Sixmile Creek Formation in other areas? I think you can correlate lithostratigraphic members. I think the timing matches up, and I think it does kind of record similar processes in terms of faulting. And so what's the influence of the hotspot bulge on the drainage? I think you are seeing a little bit of exhumation or regional exhumation, maybe not as much as we thought initially when we started thinking about this, but I think you do see a little bit. And there's a paper on, the same thing in the Pioneer, I think Batholith or Pioneer Mountains by Vogel, where they see 2 to 3 kilometers of erosional exhumation due to the hotspot. So it's not the same. I would say it's not that much actually. But yeah, I think I came in a little fast on that, but that's it. Yeah. Question.
What did you use for measuring paleo currents?
So the class.
So imbrications?
Yeah.
Good.
In your chapter 1, conclude that your data show that the initiation of faulting was around 17. But your data just starts around 17.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily the initiation of faulting.
Yeah, I would say maybe before, because and also that's the point of chapter 3, right? Is to model the faults, because you don't really that's why I came up with chapter 3, is because you can't get like very specific dates from this, but with chapter 3, I think that was answering that other part. So
some of us are mapping, especially in what part of the Western, are starting to question whether there really is a transition, whether there really is something happening between the 6 mile in terms of the extensional faulting. Was it just a continuum to today, or was there really something?
So
the transition from low angle to high angle faulting is, I guess, what we're puzzling about.
So I did get some data from the Madison River or the Madison Range fault, and it does look like you do get this change in the ages at around like 20, something like that. Yeah, I just, because I just got it like 2 weeks ago and I was a little excited, so I just took a look. But it does look like you get a change somewhere around there. So
yeah, I'm just kind of curious on how you would kind of differentiate between just like the basin and range exhumation or faulting versus actual thermal flows from the Yellowstone system.
yeah,
'Cause
so
I'm thinking like you're kind of talking about this exhumation change at like 15 or 17 million years ago, and at that point, the hotspot's still under like the Columbia plateau.
Mhm.
So could you really just be seeing, potentially more of like a local tectonic signal, potentially not even related to the Yellowstone hotspot, related to changing plate boundary conditions, like the San Andreas fault or something like that, as opposed to kind of jumping to attribute it to Yellowstone? I guess,
Can-
just kind of wondering how you piece out like local, and I guess maybe your chapter 3 will touch on local fault.
Yeah, so the
First,
ages, if it was faulting for within the drainage, the ages would be around 20, but they're, like I said, so Chloe also, so that was one thing that they also did, or Chloe kind of did, that's also why we did the faults. So she collected samples. So the samples within the drainage were collected at specific locations to be far away from faulting, so we wouldn't get that exhumation signal. And so those are much older. They're like 30 or 40 or whatever. And then she did collect samples just slightly closer to the Madison Range fault, and those did tend to be younger. And then the samples that I was just telling her about tend to be younger. So I think if they were related to faulting, if I think this is what you're asking, right? Your question, if they're related to Basin and Range style faulting, they would be in the younger range, like 20 all the way down to like 9 MA or someone like that. Was that what you were asking?
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to wonder how, how can you kind of piece out the tectonic driver versus, we've had normal faulting and exhumation in these same areas, like as Colleen kind of alluded to, far before the Yellowstone hotspot was here. And so how would you piece out kind of a thermal bulge, like a regional thermal uplift as opposed to just kind of a local faulting signal?
Yeah, I think it would be so when you say faulting, are you going back to older faulting or Basin and Range style faulting?
Oh, I mean, just any sort of
Okay.
football
Yeah,
exhibition.
the locations, because
Okay.
it has to be close. It actually has to be on the foot wall to record faulting exhumation. It's like there's a whole process to sampling on faults to get the fault related exhumation. If it's not really close to a fault, it's probably not going to record unless you have like a ton of exhumation, which I don't think you have in the case of these ones at least.
Well, can I?
Yeah.
So the bulge should have been in the Gallatin, headwaters of the Gallatin, let's say, or nearby, at about what time?
Yeah, so Pearson Morgan had this idea that
Yeah, I just can't remember the date.
they have an idea that the bulge travels ahead
Okay.
of the hotspot, so it would be somewhere like 10 to
10?
6. Yeah,
And you didn't see a signal for 6 to 10 as your.
I mean that's the thing, it's like between 15 17 to like 5, so
Okay.
anytime in before there.
So what's been bugging me, who has worked, I look at all that early on cooling, and I take laramide, right? Up to the blocks. Has somebody worked on that to put that in perspective?
Are you talking about the early cooling that
Yeah,
you
the
see?
early cooling, the dramatic cooling.
So I don't think anybody like specifically has. Chloe kind of talked about it,
Okay,
but there are things going on at that time,
Sure.
that they could explain. I think there's a climate change, and the
Yeah.
Eocene
You've seen thermal maximum, but
something. But I think someone says there's something related to they give. I know there's people that give several things going on at that time that could explain. But I don't know. That's not. I'm not focusing on that. But
right.
yeah.
I think this lady Jenna Camphor working with Dave Pearson and Willie Gunther, and she has a paper where they were just looking for the laramide sort of age on a lot of the rust faults in the area. So I think their paper it's been in review for a while. I think it should be coming out.
Oh, it just seemed like for setting what you've done in perspective, to at least address that early cooling.
That open paper, I don't know what paper that is, but that would be the Pioneer Complex in northern Idaho. That's a long way from a hotspot. Be recording that level with bulge.
Okay, I think it was in Montana. I'm not, I kind of forget where it was from.
Local,
Okay,
his work is on the Pioneer portal.
okay.
Oh,
He hasn't worked in Montana unless he was invested.
Well, yeah, they see,
Bars, I say.
Well, I know. some- Peter Yakovlev did some calculations. And I, of course, proved everything that, which suggested that the thermal bulging effect wouldn't go farther than maybe 100 kilometers from the side of the hotspot.
okay.
And I'm pretty sure that, yeah, I just
Well,
don't know that paper.
They see a signal at like, I think 10 MA. That they, I don't know if there's normal faulting. I think they say there's no normal faulting in that
There's
area.
no.
do you want to go up to the references? Can you point to that? One? Or is it on there?
I don't think I put it in the references because I don't
never
cite
mind.
it, but we can look at it. I mean, I can just
Okay.
pull it up real quick.
Yeah.
Well, later, I guess, but, or you want to do it now?
No.
Okay,
Everybody's-
I can do it right now.
Can I just, could we look at unit 3 and unit 4 again?
Do you want to see the pictures or? Here, this is the pictures. I have more pictures. too.
Okay, and just go through your descriptions again. I was fast trying to take notes.
It's just a bunch of fluvial tephra deposit. I think they're probably, so I think these are, I think you get in some kind of eruption and then it just like floods the rivers and I think it gets deposited in the rivers. That's what it looks like. You can see some kind of fluvial features here, but
And
Just-
the thickness is,
like 30 meters.
okay. And then can we get that unit 4?
Yeah.
Is that lithified? Or is it just kind of?
Kind of, no, yeah,
Figured out crop.
yeah.
Yeah, that looks like an outcrop.
Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of thinking, Carl's like where I mapped this in the Ruby Valley, or like how you described your units like 2, 3, 4. It does seem to kind of follow the
Some more?
traditional like Thomas and Sears members of the Sweetwater member, kind of local derived. Then who should we remember too, the member 3, which a bunch of abundant tuffers would be the Anderson
Did you
Ranch.
say, well, since you guys didn't respond, I guess you don't have any comments. It's
And then
been
the
3 months.
top member with a well-rounded port size would be the big old river member, so I mean,
Wait, could you say that again? Sorry.
to say, and then your member 4. The top member would be their youngest member, the Big Hole River member, which they attribute to the far travel rounded quartzite cobbles from Central
So
Idaho.
the way I see that is that the Big Hole River member is just a fluvial, the axile
That's
fluvial
crazy.
channel deposits.
Eastern Montana is like literally 2/3 of the frickin' state. It's just poorly worded.
What is that? Is that from the
Whoever
urine?
reads it's gonna come up with their own thing of what they think is important.
Stuart, can you get control?
Is there somebody out there? Yeah, there you
Well, let's ask him if anyone has any questions.
Okay,
And
I
then
guess.
like-
In the middle of it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess unit 4, I would just say is a pediment gravel, which they do have one of those in the Ruby Valley, right? And then I think what's the first member, the Sweetwater Creek? Member?
Yeah, Sweetwater Creek is.
that would be like the base-
Elaborate.
Yeah, the basin margin deposits, which you don't really see too much in here because it's hard to get on the basin margins because there's so much private property.
Yeah.
You can kind of see it. So that's what I would say is the Sweetwater Creek member. And then like units 1 and 2 and anything else that's fluvial kind of I would put as the Big Hole River member. And then unit 3 would be their Anderson Ranch. And then unit 4 is just a pediment gravel. I don't know where you would put that.
Maybe you should look at your DZ.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Because I think like And you're like, what, a seventh in the quartzite cobbles, I think you're like a 1710. And they peak and then a few younger, like 1400, like that.
Yeah,
That
well-
could be belt, right? Like Lempire. It's true.
It'd be, I don't know, it'd be interesting to compare it with like the La Hood nearby. And versus the stuff at East Central Idaho and along that group. But I mean, the La Hood typically has like a lot of Archean in it, but I thought I remember that Chance had a few that had only Paleoproterozoic, but I'll have to relook at his map.
yeah, well, you guys can see the data.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have one thermocom is a sky that seemed to show really, so the peak exit cooling was quite old, right? It was 15, you know? Like it's sort of the, it was modest cooling, you know?
Sorry.
Yeah, so for this one.
Uh-huh.
Most of the action seems to. Sort of
15?
50.
50, okay, yeah.
So it all seems to suggest that the exhumation related to tectonics is really famous.
Mm.
20 and sort of a modest.
Yeah, moderate. That's what Marissa, when we showed her, Marissa Tremblay, we showed her the cooling for, the younger stuff. She said it was like that much, yeah.
So would you agree that if whatever the Yellowstone hotspot would have done in the area would have been pretty modest?
Yeah.
So it's just, and this doesn't kind of make sense. I mean, you could argue that, the dynamics of a hotspot would have been a much more long wavelength.
Mhm.
You would see short wavelength issues, unless you react to it.
Yeah. I think we were expecting about like 1 kilometer of exhumation before, and if you start thinking about like geothermal gradients and whatnot, it's less than that, so, or about, yeah.